and welcome everyone to today's event, Strategic Synergies, India-U.S. Technology Cooperation. This is the second in a series of conversations that are part of the Motwani Jadeja U.S.-India Dialogue series here at Hudson. It's my pleasure to welcome Asha Motwani to be with us today. Since its founding in 1961, Hudson has worked at the intersection of technology, strategy, and policy. Hudson seeks to advise public policymakers and private sector leaders through extensive programs of briefings, publications, and conferences like this one. At Hudson Institute, we have long believed in the importance of fostering a stronger U.S.-India partnership. Hudson's India program aims to bring together U.S. and Indian perspectives on strategic issues. Amid an increasingly competitive global landscape, technology cooperation has emerged as a vital component of the United States-India strategic partnership. The U.S.-India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technology was launched in January 2023. Since then, government, business, and academic institutions have expanded cooperation in both the civilian and defense technologies. It is my pleasure to now invite India's Chargé d'Affaires, Ambassador Raghunathan, to deliver opening remarks. Ambassador Raghunathan's distinguished career has included serving as ambassador to the Republic of Korea, at the embassies in Myanmar, Turkey, and Hong Kong, and as head of the Policy Planning Division at the Ministry of External Affairs. Thank you for being with us, Madam Ambassador. The podium is yours.
Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be with you this morning, and truly a good way of making an otherwise humdrum Monday, which is my least favorite day of the week, a little better, that I get to talk with and to interact with a group of people, many of whom are good friends and all of whom are people who have a lot of awareness of the relationship with India and what we can and should be doing in the months ahead. Thank you so much to the team at Hudson for organizing this interaction and this event on the India-US Technology Cooperation. The theme for today's interaction is, of course, India-US Tech Cooperation. But when I was speaking to Aparna on what I could focus on, she suggested that I could make this a kind of a broader conversation, which is not just restricted to the tech aspect. And that was an easy thing for me to agree to because it makes my life so much easier. So I thought that I would just talk about what I am assessing from the embassy's perspective on where we stand at on the India-US larger cooperation, the strategic cooperation right now. I've been in DC now for about 2 years, and it has been in many ways a very remarkable time for us. Just the last year alone, if you were to look at what we have managed to witness, what we have achieved, what we have sown the seeds of, I think there is a lot for us to take stock of and a lot for us to celebrate, and also a lot for us to say that, okay, these are the things that we need to continue working on, pushing forward on in the months to come. When I first came here back in August 22, the impression that I had was that India and the US are really, it's a very, very important relationship, but it's so far away geographically that we'll probably have a few delegations here and there, a few ministers here and there. You know, the distance when I was computing, it's 12,000 kilometers, which is about 7,500 miles. And I thought, okay, maybe we'll get a minister once in 2 months, 3 months, whatever. When I came, in the first year itself, we had, you name the minister, you name the leader, we had that person going back and forth. In the past 2 years, Prime Minister Modi and President Joe Biden have had 8 interactions. Prime Minister's landmark state visit in June last year, President Biden's visit in September for the G20 were, of course, the most prominent of those, but they have had 6 other interactions. We have had 20 visits to India by US cabinet and senior officials, and almost the same number of Indian officials and ministers who have visited the US, all for substantive bilateral interactions. We have had any number of business delegations. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a delegation of the top Indian pharma CEOs who came for conversations with their US counterparts. All of this activity and all of this conversation is has resulted in a lot for us to be able to show for the relationship between India and the US. Indian investments in the US, right now, we have over 200 companies who have invested about $40 billion in the US across the 50 states, with about 500,000 jobs having been created. Similarly, US investments in India, about $63 billion. All the major US companies have a presence, have some sort of operations in India, whether it is Apple, whether it is Google, Microsoft, Intel, and so on. Also companies dealing with the critical and emerging technologies, which takes us to the theme of today's conversation, which is India-US tech cooperation. Within the framework of ISET, which we have been introduced to this morning, we have managed in the roughly 15 months since ISET was launched in January last year, we have seen tangible progress having been made in semiconductors, in telecommunications, in artificial intelligence. And I would say even more importantly that we are turning to each other to seek solutions for some of the issues and some of the challenges that we have identified as being meaningful and necessary for us as nations to grapple with in the months to come. Technology, in fact, also underpins a lot of our cooperation in other key areas. If we take defense as an example, we have truly moved from a buyer-seller relationship to a relationship which is based on co-development and co-production. The most high-profile development was, of course, in June last year when the GE-HAL deal was announced. That was for the GE 414 engines to be made in India. That is, of course, still work in progress. There are many more T's that need to be crossed and I's that need to be dotted by the two companies before they're able to bring it to actual fruition. But at least the governmental clearances and the governmental nods have been received. Similarly, the MQ-9B, that's, I think, another transformative development which we are looking forward to materializing in the coming weeks and months. At a more broad-based level, if you just look at the kind of exercises that our respective armed forces are part of, the shift that has taken place to bring some of the smaller companies into the action in terms of what we can do with each other. The Indus X is one new forum which has been created, which I think is when we reflect 10 years down the line, we will find that a lot more has been brought to the table because of all these new conversations that are taking place. Moving on to another very exciting area, and that is space. Apart from a project which has been about 10 years in the making, which is the NISAR project, which is coming up now for launch in a few months' time, we are also working together in very concrete terms on the human spaceflight mission. We are looking at what we can do within the framework of Artemis now that India took the decision again during Prime Minister's visit to become part of the Artemis Accords. These are all areas of exploration at the moment, but I'm very confident that this will lead to something tangible and concrete in the coming months. Education and skilling partnership, this is an area of utmost importance for us, given the kind of how should I say, the kind of awareness that our societies have, that education really holds the key for socioeconomic development of a nation, and the awareness that we also have that India, with its wealth of human resource, has the capacity to be able to meet the needs of both the economies and the global economy. And what can we do in the space of education and skilling to make this human resource meaningful for the challenges that we are meeting? In this context, the India-US Global Challenges Institute, the MOU that we signed in September last year when President Biden was in India, it's still not yet in implementation mode, but I believe that the nature of the conversations that are taking place between institutes of excellence on both sides will allow us again to see something meaningful happen in the coming weeks and months. We have a very large student community here in the US, about 350,000 students now in the US. Many of them in the STEM disciplines, and we believe that these people, these young people, because of the manner in which they are part now of the US educational ecosystem, will be able to serve as a very vibrant connection between the two countries and enable us to understand each other so much better than we currently do. Couple other areas where I believe that our cooperation has been meaningful and has yielded tangible outcomes. Energy and climate change mitigation efforts. This has been an area of focus for the longest time. But during the past year, we've done some interesting things. We have come together to form the Global Biofuels Alliance within the G20 framework. We are working on the US-India Strategic Clean Energy Partnership. This is an old partnership, but I think that it has received a far more practical orientation over the past couple of years than it has ever in the past. Climate change, climate action and finance mobilization dialogue, and of course what we are doing within the framework of the International Solar Alliance. With the kind of shared focus that we have in this space, we do believe that we will finally be able to move away from the erstwhile focus, which has been more on saying we need to do something, we need to do something, we need to do something, to a stage where we have concrete ideas on the table, and we also have the capacity to put money where our mouth is. And we have, for example, created the $1 billion Green Climate Fund, which is jointly anchored by the two, by DFC on the US side and NIIF on the Indian side. And this will be a means for us to be able to bring more funds onto the table. So all of that is an indication of the range of conversations that we are having across the specifically the tech spectrum. And this is not surprising considering the kind of wealth of strength which the US has in core research and innovation, in making the overlap between research and industrial activity meaningful. India has a vast pool of young talent, an increasingly entrepreneurial mindset, and a focus on technological advancement, all within a framework of that emphasizes common rules, in a framework that emphasizes the need for us to flourish together and to ensure that a robust base is created that allows talent to flourish. We see the scope for us to use the digital revolution in India to meet shared challenges, to find ways for us to deal with the situations, the geopolitical situations that we are all faced with, and ways in which we would be able to enhance our not only our technological but also our human resource cooperation to address those challenges. So in short, I would say that given India's focus and strategic objectives, given the US's focus and strategic objectives, the shared value systems that the two nations have, we are natural partners. There is so much that we can offer to each other. There is so much that we can expect from each other, that a strong India-US relationship makes not only our two countries stronger, but it also makes the world stronger. Examples of this we have seen in very vivid and tangible terms during COVID, when we, I think, appreciated for the first time just how important it is for us to be able to secure our supply chains, not only in areas like defense and what are conventionally the national security priorities, but also in areas which are softer, like health, where it is by working together that we were able to come out of the situation that we were faced with at that time, and to also help countries around the world in meeting those challenges. Again, it is because of the shared recognition that we have so much to offer to each other that we have been able to work together impactfully within the Indo-Pacific framework and also within other smaller groupings that we have created that we are part of. Quad is one of them, I2U2 is another. And I think these are all forums that exist because they make sense to us and because we are able to figure out how we are able to leverage our respective strengths and reorient our policies to be able to meet our shared challenges. Just want to sum all that up by saying that when I look back and I reflect on what I have appreciated and what I have learned over my 2 years over here, it is that the India-US partnership has really come into its own. It has matured. We are now in a position of being able to turn to each other when we face difficulties, when we face challenges for which we need to find solutions. It has become very natural for us to look to each other and to say that, hey, this is an issue, and how are you reading this situation that is evolving? Would you like to work with us? Would you like to work with some of our like-minded partners and so on? There is a phrase that has been used a lot, both by Indian leaders as well as by American leaders, and that is that the India-US relationship is really the most consequential partnership in the world today. And I would say that this is a message that has gone down in the bureaucracies on both sides, which is, as anyone who represents vibrant democracies would understand, that getting the bureaucracy on board is so critical for carrying forward, translating a vision and making sure that that vision becomes reality and does not just lose its way just because of sheer inertia. But when you now talk to anyone, whether it is on the US side or on the Indian side, you will find that the responsiveness, the receptivity, the willingness to make the changes, both the mindset changes as well as the policy changes, is very much there. Of course, having said that, there are occasions when we have encountered a few, shall I say, minor bumps along the road, but those have been possible for us to address, and we have been able to talk with each other, to help each other understand where we are coming from, and to really demonstrate that even while there are, it's not a thornless path, but these are paths that we are ready to walk together. So with that, I would like to close and thank you so much for your attention and look forward to, I wish you all a great session ahead. Thank you.
And thank you. Welcome to all of you to the panel on strategic synergies, India-US tech cooperation. To discuss an issue that is in the news, we are fortunate to have with us today stellar panel of experts. All of them are well known. I am not going to read out their bios. I'll just use sort of few words to introduce them. Lisa Curtis, to my immediate left, is Senior Fellow and Director, Indo-Pacific Security Program. Rudra Chaudhary is Director, Carnegie India. Konark Bhandari is Fellow at Carnegie India. Vikram Singh is Senior Advisor, Asia Program at US Institute of Peace. And Daniel Markey is Senior Advisor, South Asia Programs at US IP. Each of the speakers will offer some initial remarks, and then there'll be a moderated conversation. Turning to you, Lisa, could you share your perspective on the strategic dimension of the deepening US-India cooperation in the tech arena from the American lens and drawing upon your experience at the White House? Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Aparna, for inviting me to be here today. Thanks to the Hudson Institute, and it's an honor to be with such other distinguished speakers today. So right now, I think there's a sort of hyper-focus on the technology relationship between the US and India. But I think it's important to remember that technology discussions have always, well, at least for the last couple of decades, since I've been focusing on US-India relations, technology discussions have always formed an important part of the relationship. And I think back to about 2 decades ago, in 2003, when as a senior advisor at the State Department, I accompanied former U.S. Ambassador Ken Juster, who was then an undersecretary at the Commerce Department, I accompanied him to New Delhi in 2003 to inaugurate the U.S.-India High Technology Cooperation Group, otherwise known as the HTCG. So I just want to put that in perspective. Now, if you fast forward 15 years, when Ken Juster was then ambassador to India, I was deputy assistant to the president and National Security Council senior director for South and Central Asia. Around 2018, this is when the Trump administration took the major step of enabling India to receive access to armed drone technology, the MQ-9Bs that the Chargé just mentioned. And in fact, India was the first country, first non-NATO partner to be granted such access to such technology. And a few months later, of course, the Trump administration elevated India to Strategic Trade Authorization 1 status, enabling India to access dual-use goods. And of course, come to now, the present day, and we hear a lot about the initiative on critical and emerging technologies, the ISET dialogue that was launched by the two countries' national security advisors in January 2023. And this certainly has become the centerpiece of the partnership. It's resulted in the breakthrough agreement, which the Chargé mentioned, for the US and India to co-produce, excuse me, and co-develop jet engine technology. And the fact that India now serves as a hub for US ship repair is yet another example of how our increasing technology cooperation is building confidence between our two nations and, pushing our military ties closer and closer. The US and India are cooperating on things like semiconductor, supply chains, quantum technologies, next generation telecommunications networks. We're working together to bridge the digital divide between the West and the global South. And I think India's leadership at the G20 last year, especially on digital public infrastructure, demonstrated this critical role that India will play in this endeavor. And of course, together, we are helping shape the framework for the responsible and safe use of AI. Our two countries are cooperating to advance the use of AI in cyber defense and in protecting critical infrastructure. And this is because our two countries share technology values that emphasize both a culture of innovation, but also rules that place human life and human dignity and progress at the center of our AI research and development. And what I mean is both of our nations want to harness the power of AI to benefit our societies and reduce the chances for the malign use of AI. Now, before I hand the microphone over, one note of caution that I would raise when we talk about enhancing technology cooperation between the US and India, particularly in the defense realm, is, of course, India's continued reliance on Russian military technology. So it's hard to imagine that a continued close Russia-India defense relationship would not impact US-India defense ties going forward. I think India is confident that it can segment its relations with Russia and the United States, and that it could put up firewalls that would safeguard US technology. But I think the US will remain cautious and reluctant to link its secure networks to Indian platforms and share sensitive defense information when India is still heavily reliant on Russian platforms. So I would just add that one note of caution to my remarks. And I think one of the questions that Aparna wanted me to address was the potential for US-India technology cooperation in a potential future Trump administration. Look, I would fully expect this cooperation, technology cooperation, to continue the momentum. We saw a flourishing of the US-India relationship during the previous Trump administration, we saw very good ties between the leadership, between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump when he was president. So I would fully expect that these two leaders would pick up the relationship where it left off were we to see a second Trump administration. So let me just leave it there, and thank you very much.
Thanks, Lisa. Rudy, could I ask you to offer your perspective from the Indian side and inform the audience on why access to high tech is so important for India at a strategic level?
No, thanks, Aparna, and it's great to be here with friends and colleagues alike. Look, I think there are two sets of interrelated imperatives, right? One is what you might call internal to India. One is what you call geopolitical, right? And I will get back on the Russia question as well. On the internal side, look, I think there's a verve in India today, which is moving the country in every which direction to access high tech, co-produce, and co-develop in India. So there's a very clear understanding, both in the private sector as well as in government, to move the country to a very different profile in terms of manufacturing. Now here there is a need for India as well. This has to do with our own economic independence, right? Which in itself creates certain kinds of dependencies, right? And relationships. Now in the last 10 years, the government has done quite a bit internally to deregulate, to allow for this space of strategic technology in general to thrive. So take one example, space. We deregulated space a couple of years ago. Till then, it was completely state-run. It led to the mushrooming of hundreds of startups and MSMEs. Now, please think of any other jurisdiction in the world where a deregulation equals hundreds of startups. Of those hundreds, today we have at least a dozen that have serious capabilities. Asha sitting here, I think she just flew down from the Bay Area, where VCs in the Bay Area are putting money into these startups. And we're looking at an ecosystem of 400 to 500 launches at scale and at cost, right? That works for India, and frankly, it works for you and the world. I have no doubt if this verve continues in about 5 or 7 years from now, that ecosystem will positively challenge the monopoly held by companies like Starlink even, right? And I think that's a general good for the world. So there's an economic verve, there's support for that economic verve internally. And today, frankly, you have the kind of capabilities where the startups, MSMEs, and large companies are knocking on your doors for access to greater technologies. You didn't necessarily have that capability 10 years ago. And that's important to keep in mind, which also means then you have to deal with tricky issues like export controls, which Konark's the real expert on. So that's the first set of imperatives, kind of like what you may call internal. On the second is geopolitical, right? And I think here there are 5 vectors I'll go through very quickly. One is just the US-India relationship, right? I think there's a very clear understanding that this is the most consequential relationship for India across the board. Whether you're in Bengaluru, whether you're in Hyderabad, or whether you're in Delhi, there's a very clear understanding. There's a market here, there's capital here, there's technology here. And now there's a kind of a mirror image in India, right? So the key is how do you put the 2 and 2 together, yeah? In India, the challenges around deregulation. In the US, the challenges around export controls. And those are things that are being worked out by ISET and other structures. So there is something imperative in the US-India relationship itself. But the second and third, fourth, and fifth are geopolitical, right? US's own changing relationship with China, there's a structural shift. India's own problems with China. Tightening Sino-Russian ties, which is a real challenge for us in India. And frankly, the war in Europe, which has an effect on us given our military dependency on Russia. Take this full stack together, right? And you've got a set of opportunities and challenges, right? The opportunity in many ways is ISET, right? And it's worth keeping in mind that ISET was nothing more than 4 lines in a joint statement in the summer of 2022 on the back of a Quad summit in Tokyo. That's it, right? Accelerate 2 years to where we are exactly right now. You've got about billions of dollars of economic activity and transaction between the two sides. In some cases, it's about the United States selling drones to India, the largest deal so far. In some cases, it's about technology transfer and engines. In some cases, it's about setting up a semiconductor ATP or an assembly and packaging unit in India, right? In other cases, it's about exploring newer areas like in AI, quantum, biotech, etc. But it's just worth keeping in mind all this verve activity in 2 years. Last point I'll just make is that ISET or deeper technology ties within or outside of ISET It works for both India and the US. Think of any other jurisdiction where you can produce technology at cost and scale. You can't do it anywhere else. Where there's a jurisdiction where you have some degree of trust, reliability, essentially a trusted supply chain, right? And in a jurisdiction where half of what you produce will be absorbed by the market economy at force. You can't find that in any other part of Asia even, right? So Vietnam, and I'm not being competitive here, but there are lots of parts of Asia that provide very good real estate for manufacturing. Where do you do this at scale? Where do you do it at cost? And where do you do it where you have the economy of scale to actually absorb at least half of what you produce? There are challenges to ISET, and perhaps you could get into those in Q&A.
Konak, Rudy mentioned a bit about the space semiconductors, so did Lisa, but that is your forte. And so, sort of, why do you think space and semiconductors are so big in ISET? I mean, why are the two countries focusing so much on this?
Right.
Thank you.
So to begin with space, so actually India and US have a pretty storied history of cooperating in the space sector. The first ever space rocket launched from India was a Apache rocket, launched like 7 decades ago. So we have a long history of cooperation. As the ambassador mentioned, we have the NISA radar project as well, and recently we signed up to the Artemis Accords. So there has been strong G2G cooperation. Now the reason why this has been put under the ISET umbrella has been for the reason which Rudy has also spoken about, which is basically that the government has realized that we need to have more space-based assets out there. The war in Ukraine plus the Galwan Valley clash with the Chinese has shown that there was a glaring lack and there was a big deficiency when it came to space-based assets. So ISRO is an agency which does both the conceiving of the missions, the launch of the missions, and the R&D as well. It can't do everything alone. So now it's basically trying to farm out these responsibilities to the private sector in India as well. For that, it has taken out certain reforms. It's deregulated the entire sector, which has led to capabilities in a host of verticals from orbital debris removal to rockets to space situational awareness as well. So Indian companies are now finally finding their feet in this specific area. I think it works well for the US because you sort of want to have a partner who can co-develop at cost and at scale, like Rudy mentioned. That's something which I think India can add value. Space is a sector where we traditionally have had a very strong, capabilities as well. So I would say space, for that reason, is certainly something which stands out for, it's a low-hanging fruit for cooperation for both India and the US. On semiconductors, India we have never really had a strong domestic manufacturing ecosystem. We have had a strong chip design capability for sure, but that has normally served as a back office for most of the MNC firms in India. We haven't really had any local, strong, domestic, homegrown chip design firm. Until recently, I think we're now having 10 to 9 startups in MSME, who've shown promise, but nothing at the scale of an NVIDIA or like a Qualcomm. So the way forward there is that there are alignment of priorities as well. The Biden administration and the CHIPS program office has sort of come out very clearly and said that we need to focus on the advanced and leading edge nodes, right? On the part of India, there's been a clear acknowledgement that we will not be going for those advanced leading edge nodes anytime soon. The kind of projects which are used in India, be it point of sale terminals, be it drones, be it aircraft and tanks, they essentially use mature end nodes, right? So the subsidy policy, which has also been given out by the Indian government, has largely been used to set up packaging plants for these mature node products. And recently, last week, I think the Biden administration also announcing that they intend to levy a 25 to 50% tariff on Chinese mature nodes. I think will be music to the ears of Indian policymakers. I think that is something we can look forward to increasingly, grabbing market share as well. So I would say there's definitely alignment when it comes to semiconductors because the vertical we're looking at in semiconductors is very much different. Advanced leading edge node is not what we're looking at right now in India. We're looking at more mature node production, and that is an area where the US has been keen to let India play its role. So those are the two areas I think where we can have some cooperation.
Thanks, Konak. Vikram, turning to you, why, many people ask, has the US been willing to share the crown jewels of its defense technology with a non-security ally?
So first of all, thank you, Aparna, Hudson, Nasha, for having this forum. I think it's a really useful series of discussions, and it's really nice to be with only friends on the panel. So I hope you can get us to argue a little bit because we might agree on too much. But I'll try to be brief and a little bit provocative. I don't think the U.S. has decided to share its most advanced technology, defense technology, with India. But I don't think that's bad for India. I don't think the U.S. wants to do that with anybody. And so even when you look at things like the AUKUS Accords, which is where we really could get to the furthest level of cooperation, even there are probably some exquisite technologies. There are certainly some exquisite technologies that the U.S. is going to ultimately keep to itself. And this debate about what do you let me have or not have actually obscures a lot of the reality of what happens in technology cooperation. One big thing, of course, that's happened is that the U.S. has seen its almost monopoly on the highest edges of technology, the frontiers of technology, erode away. So there are areas, including quantum and AI, including semiconductor manufacturing, are areas where the U.S. is definitely not the leader. And I think what you've seen is a recognition in the United States that as not just China, but the rest of the world has grown, and the post-World War II and then post-Cold War sort of era of American economic and technology dominance has shifted. Some people call this a multipolar world that they really want to see. Naturally, as the biggest pole in that world, the United States would like to keep itself as high as possible among the poles, but recognizes that a lot of technology and innovation is going to happen in other places. In some cases, that'll be worrying because it'll be a state that's adversarial like China. But in most cases, when it comes to the vast bulk of the global economy and the global innovation economy, that's going to be happening in the United States or in our allies or in partner countries. And India is a big part of that universe of allies and partners. Not an ally, but a critical partner. Most of this technology cooperation is organic. The United States and India have very deep ties at an official level, and that relationship has been really getting sort of better and better, certainly over the last, since the low point of the post-Indian nuclear test in the late 90s, but from the end of the Clinton administration on, you see this sort of steady climb that Lisa and I can certainly catalog in exhaustive detail on the U.S. side across all of those administrations. So that's been happening, but the basis of the technology cooperation has essentially been that America built its engineering economy and built Silicon Valley on a lot of Indian talent. And it's no coincidence that the biggest technology companies in the United States are headed by immigrants from India. It's not a surprise. I grew up in Menlo Park, California, and my street had exactly one Indian family on it. That's me. That same street is now, I think, 70% Indian families, right? So we have seen a blending of our talent, and that fed back into India's Silicon Valley, mostly Bangalore, and Chennai and Hyderabad, but increasingly all over the country. This synergy is kind of an unstoppable flywheel. And what governments have been doing in both cases is saying we should get on that flywheel and we should make sure that we're taking advantage where we can and be careful to protect our equities where we must. And so, sure, the United States won't share everything, and sure, the Indians will not, because they can't and because they also probably don't necessarily want to, won't shed all dependency on Russian technologies. What you got to was a point where both sides said it's in our interest to figure out how we're going to cooperate, even with the limitations we might be under. India, 98+% of any licensing requests go through for India. It does as well or better than any other partner. That's not it's not a massive barrier. It's a complicating factor. It increases cost. But just as often as it might be the government's not wanting to share something, it could be the companies themselves not wanting to share something. So every time a company enters into any kind of strategic partnership, it has to decide, what does this mean for our IP? What does this mean for down the line? I mean, if we decide we're going to produce with a partner, at some point that partner is producing and selling that product. What's the impact on our business over time? Will we have moved on and be ready to have that go off and be something that's produced in Israel or Turkey or wherever it might be? And so I think the economic decisions made by businesses, along with the bureaucratic decisions together, form the opportunity space and the sets of obstacles. So Chargé mentioned the GE engine deal and mentioned that the government piece is taken care of. Okay, well, we don't have dates. We don't know what's happening. Why? Because corporate entities now have to figure out how they're going to do this. The same thing goes with the General Atomics drone deal. There's pricing. It's been approved. It's been notified on the US side. But the Indian MOD and the company have to negotiate the final terms and make that deal really happen. What used to happen was there was just sort of a gap and there was no way to talk about these issues. Today, if there's a deal that's possible and there's companies on both sides or the governments want it or it's just an idea, there are people in government on both sides that are there to like say, we want to hear your ideas, we want to help, there's a problem, we want to help fix it. That's really different. Now, that's the biggest change I've seen, and ISET is a big part of it because both systems now know that from the National Security Advisor down, there's a strategic direction to, hey, make things work, make things happen. And I think that's the biggest difference, more than the willingness of either party to do or not do certain things.
Thanks, Vikram. Last but not least, Dan. I'd like you to be the most provocative person on this panel. Because right now, everybody's been really nice, and I need Dan to say something which will get everybody, turning to Dan. So Dan,
Sure.
close yours.
Aparna, thank you. And thanks again to Hudson. It's great to be on this panel. It was great to be able to follow the ambassador's remarks. And as you've already heard, there are a lot of really, really good big picture reasons to be very excited and enthusiastic about the US-India relationship and about tech partnership in particular. I think both sides, we are in a moment where both sides appreciate the centrality of this technology competition and our success in it for our broader success as nations, as societies. We recognize that data and the capacity to make sense of it and harness it to other ends for practical purposes of a variety of the types we've already heard is essential for us to compete. It's at the heart of our national power. And there's no question from a US perspective that India brings scale, a labor pool, and all kinds of other opportunities. Even is it in itself a kind of an important data source for realizing these aspirations. And from an Indian perspective, the United States brings existing capabilities, technological capabilities, world-leading technologies, and capital to that story. So we've talked about sort of this excitement side. What are the questions, or what are the, Aparna's asking me to be more provocative, and when we have faced, Ambassador mentioned some frustrations, some setbacks along the way. This hasn't been, as she said, a path without thorns. It has been. So I'll raise 4 questions. The first of the questions is, do we have right-sized expectations for this relationship? What are the limits, the practical limits, to our technological cooperation between India and the United States? Are we thinking realistically about scale, about speed, about the sophistication levels of the kinds of technologies that we want to cooperate in? Or are we kind of aiming for the fences and tilting at windmills, maybe talking about the kinds of high-end technological projects that just really aren't realistic at the moment? How can we make sure that we're thinking realistically? To what extent will this partnership actually achieve the US purpose, or partially achieve it, of de-risking, or what we sometimes call decoupling from China? To what extent can India fill in those gaps, and to what extent do we really need to be looking elsewhere as well? This is not an on or off, this is not an either or, but this is a to what extent kind of question. And to what extent can the United States solve some of India's problems in terms of that are being addressed by a Make in India agenda, India's really important desire for growth and development? Where does the United States actually play a role there, and where not? And we need to ask the question about whether we are now actually cracking the code to solving this challenge of technology cooperation in ways that we weren't before. I mean, we've been enthusiastic before. We've had great ambitions before. And so what will lead us to be more effective this time around? What's fundamentally new or different about these efforts? It's really important that the United States understand how to prioritize India in these efforts. What we should expect from India as compared to our other allies and partners, and even countries that almost don't even qualify as allies or partners. You mentioned Vietnam, right? Like, where does India fit into all of this? Because it's essential to avoid the kinds of frustration or backlash that will come if we underdeliver on our promises. Either way, right? One of the surefire killers to this relationship will be overpromising and underdelivering. That leads people to be frustrated and frankly angry. Okay, so that's the first set of questions. Second set, are we speaking plainly to each other? Are we speaking the same language, literally and figuratively? Sometimes I feel like the way we use the same words is interpreted differently on either side of this relationship. The concept of shared values, Lisa mentioned, or of like-mindedness, what does this really mean when it comes to technology? Now, is this an actual commitment to kind of an ideology in the conception, the production, and the use of new technologies? What's the content of that? Or when we say like-minded, are we really just using shorthand, which is not China? But we should be clear about which one of these things is actually operative. If it is the former, that is a set of ideas, or what are the terms of the US-India convergence on technological values? What are democratic technological values? I'm not sure I really know. The United States tends to favor a set of technological values that are often driven by, informed by private sector interests, big US tech companies. India often takes a more statist approach to understanding technological values. In digital public infrastructure, we often sort of give the benefit of the doubt, we, the United States, to our big tech companies. Whereas India is likely to be more skeptical about that and give more of a benefit of the doubt to the state. So if we're each committed to the rule of law and certain protections for our own people, whose rules and who are we protecting from what? I think we need to be plain about that. And there are also some other critical disagreements that we need to be plain about, but Lisa's already pointed these out. Others have already mentioned the differences over Russia and so on. These will have clear consequences for the nature and prospect of our technological cooperation when India plainly sees that its interests are aligned with a certain type of continued strategic cooperation with India on really important things like S-400 systems or nuclear-capable submarines and so on. These are not small issues, and they're not going away anytime soon. All right, question 3, briefly, what is the place for all of this for government policy? You know, I think there's a case to be made, and I believe Konark made the point, or no, I thought maybe Rudra made the point in the space area that the real space for the government is to get out of the way, that we do more when the government does less. But at times, it seems like that's not happening, or it's happening in ways that are a little bit too slow or not across the board. We have serious questions about FDI into India. It's not booming. It's flat or maybe even going down. Why is that? What's going on? A lot of American companies would say it's because there are too many controls, too many limits to involvement by the state. So this isn't to say that the state can't be helpful or state intervention can't be effective, especially in an era where we're seeing a kind of a new industrial policy and a need to implement that to compete internationally. But again, could the government be doing more by doing less? And last question, fourth question. What are the outer limits to the US-India strategic partnership? I think India's leaders, if you listen carefully, have actually been pretty clear about what their long-term aims are. Their aims are to achieve India's national greatness in a global environment, as Vikram pointed out, of increasing sort of multipolarity, which India can have its own independent role. In other words, India is not seeing technological cooperation with the United States as a way to help the United States compete with China, or to grow the US economy, or to create opportunities for US companies. It may do those things, but that's not India's purpose, and we need to be clear about that. What does India want? At most levels, this is completely fine. This is understandable. But at times we will see, and have seen, I think we are seeing, that India's desire is to bring in outside technologies and intellectual property to make India more capable and more competitive, and this may not create long-term a level playing field for US companies. And it may have consequences for the United States of the long run that we should be contemplating from the outset. India is not China. Let me be very clear. But Washington should learn the lessons of its history, of its relationship with China over the past so many decades. The United States benefited from technological and economic cooperation with China, our consumers and our producers. But with the benefit of hindsight, we also saw our engagement didn't transform China in the way that some people might have hoped. And beyond that, maybe we should have been a bit more circumspect about cooperation in certain very sensitive areas, which have allowed China to be more competitive with us in the long run. So what would we have done differently had we played that game again? And what might we do differently as we're playing not the same game, but a similar game with India now? Thanks.
Thanks, Dan. I'm hoping that people on the panel are going to disagree with Dan, so that I don't have to play that role. But while I ask I'd like to take one round of questions with all of you. One, feel free to comment on what somebody else said. But if Lisa wouldn't mind also referring to, you talked about Ambassador Juster and the 2003 HTCG. We had DTTI, we have ISET, so we have 3 sets of, 3 times in the last 2 decades that, that both governments have tried to work together on tech. What do you see as a challenge this time around, Lisa? Not opportunity, but challenge this time around.
Well, thank you. So first, I just did want to comment on one thing Dan said, and I think, I largely agreed with most of what he said, but I do disagree with the last point, that somehow we have something to learn about the mistakes we made with China, with India. I don't see that. I see that the imperative to cooperate with India on technology has only grown. We talked about 2003 HTCG, which was about looking for possibilities and exploring opportunities. Well, now I would say there's an absolute imperative for the US and India to cooperate on technology, and that's because of the technological competition with China. So I would actually turn what Dan said on his head, that we're in a much different situation, and there's an imperative to cooperate with India and try to break down some of those barriers, because we have to deal with the mistakes that we have made with China, and the fact that now China's racing ahead in the technology competition and has different end goals than both the US and India. And then we come back to the values that US and India share in terms of wanting a rules-based order, wanting to make sure that countries are uplifting their populations and focusing on human progress, human development, in addition to unlocking innovation for technology development. So you asked about the challenges that we face now as compared to maybe in 2003 or 10 years ago, et cetera. Well, some of them are the same, and those would be, the bureaucratic differences between our 2 governments, and some of the sort of tried and true challenges that we find in dealing with India, on having more protections in its economy, and having maybe a slightly different viewpoint on issues like data data protection, some of those issues. So I think, some of the issues are the same, some of the challenges are the same that we've been facing for a long time. But I do agree, I forget now who said it, but maybe it was Vikram, I think it was Vikram, that the fact that the NSAs are in charge of ISET makes all the difference, because they can cut through some of the bureaucratic hurdles, and they are the convening leaders of the rest of their bureaucracies. Because I think what we found before ISET was it was kind of difficult to deal with these technology issues, which were parsed out to different parts of the bureaucracy and different agencies controlling different issues. So I think the fact that the NSAs are in charge of ISET makes a huge difference and can help us overcome the challenges that I had just discussed. And I think I already spelled out another challenge that I see, and perhaps there are differences on the panel, but I do see that if India continues to heavily rely on Russian military gear, that at some point that will impact our ability to share our crown jewels or the most sophisticated defense technologies in the future. Not to say that, we haven't shared a lot, but I think at some point it will provide an obstacle in the future.
Thanks, Lisa. Rudy, in your remarks, you had said that you may refer to the challenges later, and you also said you will talk about Russia. So I'm going to put you on the spot.
Well, let me talk about the challenges of this panel and some of the questions that perhaps Dan has raised. Okay, on Russia. Look, one, I think we all need to just very clearly understand the United States is not an exclusive relationship for India. You have to understand that, right? It's a consequential relationship. It's really important for a variety of reasons, which we've all talked about. But this is not a country that's going to bet down on an exclusive relationship, whether it's on the diplomatic side or whether it's any particular domain of a technological asset. If you want an exclusive quantum relationship with India, it's going to be hard, right? Because what's in it for us? For all the reasons that have been raised over here. That's just a fact. And today, you're not the only player in the game when it comes to strategic technologies. Every time you increase export controls and make licenses difficult for space companies, they just go to France. Let's be very clear, where we have a very strong technology relationship. And I think, as Vikram said, I will underscore the point that we overplay the export control problem. It's not much of a problem, but there is an issue, right? Today, you have Korea, Japan, the United Kingdom, and others knocking on our doors for an ISET-like relationship. There's already a lot happening in that space. So I think just to put it in perspective, exclusive relationship is not going to happen. It's just not the way India's designed, right? And by the way, it's not the way you're designed either. On Russia, I think you've heard this many times in terms of India's position on Russia, but the facts are these, right? For historical reasons, strategic reasons, is 60% of our military dependency comes from Russia. That's just a fact, right? 85% of our dependency in armor comes from Russia, right? So till the day the United States can pony up 3,500 tanks and ship them to India with a clear supply chain, right? Let's just accept that reality. It's not going away. And by the way, those Russian tanks are sold to India by license, right? So there's difficulty in that process in itself. Does that affect us because of impacts of the war in Europe, etc.? Of course. Are we worried about supply chains? Are we worried about supplies, nuts, bolts, radiators? Absolutely. Because that is an existential threat to us on both our boundaries, right? And tax is the king of war, right? Beyond that, though, if you look at the strategic investments in defense technologies with the United States, there's a gradual steady up, right? With Russia, there's a gradual steady down. I suspect that is the diversification that the country will practice. It'll take 30 to 40 years. So let's just manage these expectations very clearly, right? You're in a place where you're not looking at additional capital expenditures in Russian technologies as of now. But there are legacy equipments, which is as crucial to our national security, which, by the way, is connected to your national security, right? Like China. So that's one on Russia. On the second part, look, Dan, I liked your points, but I think they were quite fuzzy and frankly quite generalist. And I say this in the hope of provoking more debate. Couple of things. Number one, and Lisa also mentioned this, you talk about data, shared values, and technology. I'll stick to tech and shared data. We in India, we have a data law. We actually have means by which you can check your personal data. You don't have a federal data law. So if you're talking about shared values, that's a good place to start, right? On data itself, and I'll just say this, it's an easy one to whip up, right? No big tech company today, name me one, that talks about data as a problem. They can't, because we've given it to them on a silver plate. Big issue for them, and you have someone who's written more on these issues than most. Big issue for them was the localization of data. That's all they cared about. Because if you localize data in India, one of the largest markets for companies like Meta, your business is gone, it's broken, right? You don't have localization. It's a stipulation just like you have it in the GDPR. But it's not a stipulation today that's enforced for any American company. You have free flow of personal data moving between the Bay Area and Arizona and India and anywhere else, right? So I think we have to be very clear what we mean when we say that data is an issue between the two jurisdictions. I just don't see how it's an issue any longer. On the point about DPI, that's a whole kind of different world, and just to be clear, that's outside of the kind of ISET formulae. I think there's a deep misunderstanding in the United States on digital public infrastructure. The fault is partly ours. We've not done a good enough job to explain this. The G20 process was a lightning process. I can tell you, it took effort to convince your negotiators on the imperatives of DPI, right? Which is largely about inclusion, it's about markets, about governance and technology coming together. I don't think DPI is as status as you make it out to be, right? And for this reason, none of your companies think so. Google Pay was developed in India as a product on top of digital public infrastructure. You have 500 million subscribers on Google Pay today, right? That's a model that will possibly get replicated in large parts of the global south. PhonePe, which is owned by Walmart, has the other 480 million subscribers, right? How is this a problem for America Incorporated? How is this a problem for California? I generally don't get it. There's a natural alignment between DPI, right? And we can get into what this is if you want. If you want to turn it into a DPI conversation, I'm happy to. Innovation, markets, technology, and governance coming together, right? Satya Nadella sees it, Oracle sees it, Microsoft sees it. When this stuff's going to get proliferated in the global south, which will happen, it'll be 50 and 5 and then in kind of the next 4.5 years, right? Who's going to host it on their cloud? It's AWS, it's Azure, right? So I just want to take a step back and say when we say the DPI status, it's not enough for innovation, it doesn't do well for private sector, I think you have to take a relook at what all of this means. And last point, just on China, look, it's not India's job to help you de-risk from China. You've got to figure that yourself, right? Just like we have to figure out our own relationship with China. The challenges will be dealt with separately. There's a commonality in the opportunity, right? And that opportunity is what can you get when you demonopolize economic production or the overemphasis of economic production in any one jurisdiction, right? You may call it China plus one. Companies may move to India. There'll be other ways in which you can mess around with that ecosystem and supply chain. But if you believe in trusted supply chains, which I think both governments do, my sense is that's where the commonality comes together. Micron came to India primarily because of these equations and because of ISET, right? Which is, by the way, electrified our market on semiconductors to no end, right? You're thinking about General Atomics and GE, these are legacy deals that go back a long way. Electrified under ISET, because clearly there's a common understanding of the opportunity over here, right? And lastly, on de-risking, I'll just say is this. I think in America, you're as confused about de-risking as anyone else, right? You have Elon Musk going today to China, asking for proprietary technologies on a map architecture for self-driving cars, right? When your government, on the other hand, is talking about EVs and the risks embedded in chips. So explain that to us, for instance. Those contradictions will exist. That's what market economies are about. That's what competition is about, right? So de-risking, demonopolization, these are contradictory terms. I would say focus on the opportunities because you'll have different approaches to the challenges themselves.
Thanks, Rudy. Konak, I wanted to ask you, February of this year, you wrote an article, Rudy's mentioned it, Dan mentioned it, Vikram, the export control, and you argued for a new multilateral export control regime. Right. So as to find common ground between India and the US. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So that was more on the nature of, that was more a US-centric article about what would need to be done going forward if you're sort of going to tell allies like Netherlands and Korea not to sell certain items to countries like China. The role of India in the article was not really fleshed out, but the idea was that maybe we ought to go back to a time where we sort of don't tell allies what to do, but we have a multilateral agreement where before we go and come up with national guidelines, we sort of take a call beforehand, check in with the allies and tell them, hey, listen, we're probably going to be imposing restrictions on selling lithography machines to, say, the Chinese or the Russians. So the article was more about being on the same page before you come out with individual guidelines. That was the gist of the article. But I'm happy to speak on separately how export controls can be tackled from the Indian point of view as well. So, there was this big thing 2 years back that export controls are sort of the big thing blocking tech transfer to India. We have seen now in the last couple of years that that's not necessarily the case all the time. There are cases when, for instance, the approval rate of transfers by the Department of Commerce to India is around 98%. So it's not a case that this is being held up by the Americans. But at the same time, there seems to be a lack of awareness on the Indian side of which regulations to sort of apply for when you're sort of seeking like an import license. So for that, we have this new strategic trade dialogue which has been launched between both the Commerce Ministry and the MEA in India. That has been launched last year. I think it's shown some progress. We've held a few workshops in India itself regarding export control demystification and the roadmap for Indian companies to look forward to when they want to sort of apply for imports. I'd also say that there's this thing called the VEU, the Validated End User Mechanism, right? Which is basically, I think, companies which already have a license to export it to other countries. The license list for VEU in China is about 9 companies. It's like, the big semiconductor companies and the big defense companies. For India, it's just GE. And that's kind of hard for me to figure out why that's happened. I mean, if you're sort of keen on selling more to India and you don't want to sort of get caught up in the restrictions of export control laws, it'll make sense to have a VEU license given to the big players who routinely sell to India. So that's something which we can also think about. I think on the Indian end, we also have some work to do. There are cases where certain space companies want to, serve as a payload provider to American companies. But the problem is that when they sort of host that payload, they want to get that data back to the Americans, right? And that leads to a problem because in the Indian side, the SCOMET guidelines, which are the export control guidelines in India, they're not very clear on how that data is going to be treated. Are we allowed to export it back to the Americans? So if there's no clarity on what the downstream impact of that tech is going to be, how do we even import it in the first place? So I think there is something to be done from the Indian side as well. And I think there's an unspoken thing in geopolitics as well that, if you're sort of trying to seek a piece of technology from the Americans, it might not be given to the Indians if there is somebody who's already got a piece of that tech, say maybe in Europe. The French or someone else might not be keen for someone else to have the same piece of technology since it sort of compromises them as well. So I think there are these 4 or 5 things which we can work on to sort of, smoothen out the export control issues. But yeah, that's pretty much, I think, how we can make progress going forward on export controls.
Mr. Singh, in your remarks, you talked about synergy is unstoppable. The 2 countries. So I'd like to sort of,
I said the non-government to government, the private sector synergies are unstoppable. I mean, this is just, you're not going to see, I guess it could be stoppable. We stop visas, we stop, right? Governments could stop it, but left to our own devices, the private sector is going to continue to be getting this flywheel of talent, engineering, and innovation, and it's just been growing into the investment space. It's just been expanding. So you're going to see that continuing, absent some major, major break in relations. So, for example, H-1Bs go away or something like that. It's not inconceivable. You could see large scale tariffs. You could see right now. I think we're seeing a bunch of Southeast Asian nations just had a anti-dumping countervailing duties on solar panel imports petition filed by American producers. So that kind of thing could hit India. But I think we have these conversations and they sort of are happening at these multiple levels. And one of the levels that Dan and Rudy giving us some energy were getting into was the regulatory space, where we have failed as the United States to do anything much in terms of regulation at a national level, because I think, as Dan says, we tend to let the private sector lead on these things. California has regulated, Europe is regulated, India is regulating, Japan and Korea are regulating, Brazil is regulating. I mean, there's regulatory proliferation happening out there. How the allies and partners of the United States end up working together based on all these different regulatory schema that come out is going to affect how, how ambitious our cooperation can be. So talking about that stuff is important. But to Rudy's point, I mean, we don't have anything in place on data protection, privacy, et cetera, at a national level, per se. I think it's really important if we want to maximize the strategic partnership to get strategic about it. So that would mean ISET has many, many things happening, and I love 1,000 flowers blooming, but that would really mean, okay, there's these handfuls of sectors where we have dependencies on China that are a strategic threat and vulnerability. Can we cooperate on those? What I think is happening right now is high ambition and high hopes, but then a lot of stuff that's just sort of left to go along its own path. So if we want to not be dependent on China for critical minerals, for batteries, for solar, if we want to make sure that the commodity scale, mature nodes and semiconductors there's options that are from secure, trusted sources outside of China for those sorts of things. If we're concerned about Chinese monopoly on something like display, where every screen that's not the highest end, even on a US fighter jet or aircraft or whatever, is probably Chinese at this point, right? So we need to pick a few areas where we go, okay, for the national security advisors, the things they're going to care about the most are how do we cooperate on these things? And then we're going to find lots of unexpected obstacles to that cooperation. So right now, if we are going to make it harder to get solar panels from non-Chinese countries because they are getting some piece of that solar panel from China, which they can't get from anywhere else, we might inadvertently be reinforcing China's supply chain rather than undermining it. And we're not thinking through those sorts of things. I think the United States views India, including big Indian companies like the Tatas, the Adanis, and others, as the best frontier competitors with big Chinese state-owned enterprises in many ways. And I think we see a lot of what we want to do in terms of building in India. Rudy was saying, okay, 50% of your production could be absorbed in the Indian market. Where's the rest of it going? Someone's going here, but it's got to go to places in Africa and Central Asia and Southeast Asia. And now we have, again, unexpected obstacles. India makes it difficult to come and do that stuff and then re-export it outside of India just because there's things that make the cost structure not favorable. MRO, it is starting, but it's cheaper to do it in Singapore, which is kind of crazy for most things, aircraft and ships in particular, right? Because Singapore has made it very simple. You come in, you're not going to pay anything for what you bring in. You're not going to pay anything for sending stuff back out if you come and do repairs in Singapore. India is far, far, far from that. And so that big vision hits these regulatory obstacles. And then I do think it's important to think about the digital future we're creating. And the main tension, of course, is between surveillance and privacy. It's between data, so data localization is going to work out because everyone's going to end up eating the cost to keep data in a jurisdiction while negotiating how that data can flow freely back and forth. The reason countries are doing that is primarily security focused. They want to protect their own people's data, but they also want access to it for judicial purposes, for law enforcement purposes, for counterterrorism purposes, for financial crimes purposes. We're all going to have different interpretations of whether we're comfortable with how that's being done in different jurisdictions. I think we're at a maturity level where we can have pretty honest conversations about that. I also think we're going to not agree at the end of the day that we're comfortable with each other's systems. But I don't think that is going to be something that makes it impossible to work together. I just think that's going to be reality. We don't like Europe's system, right? And so when Indians get worried about how we're not going to agree on data localization or free flow of data or whatever, or data privacy or data protection or whatever this Digital India Act that's going to move, I bet, fast this year after the elections. When we don't agree on those things, people get really worried. But I just say, look, we have no real harmony with Europe on this, but nobody thinks it's a threat to the transatlantic partnership, and nobody should think that it's a fundamental threat to the US-India partnership, in my opinion. It's just stuff to work through.
Thanks, Vikram. Dan, would you like to respond to anything?
Sure,
before
yeah, I mean,
open it up?
I think a number of points have already gotten picked up, which is great. And I take the challenge from Rudy in the way that it was given, but I would say a lot of the responses were more of a defense of India than a defense of the US-India relationship. In other words, this was an effort to explain, India's position, say, on its relationship with Russia, which, as you said, won't change for another 30, 40 years. So the United States has just got to get used to it. Okay, well, that's fine. I mean, I'm not sure how that actually gets us further to sort of coming together on a workable relationship in defense tech, other than that we need to sort of swallow that reality. And it's a reality that isn't all just about tanks or legacy technologies or things that are gradually going away. It's also a reality that relates to new technology. I mentioned S-400. I mentioned nuclear-capable submarines. I mean, these are really important spaces that India is committed still to this relationship with Russia, and that's, again, understandable, but challenging. Similarly, you said it's not India's problem to de-risk or help the United States de-risk its economy from China. Precisely right, it's not. And I don't think it's really India's intention. I don't think it's India's ambition or interest. But Americans need to also recognize that. It's not what India is interested in doing, and therefore we shouldn't assume a certain kind of convergence of ambition on that point. India is doing what it's doing for its national purposes, which again is totally fine as long as we understand that that's the reality. That's my point. And that we're not kind of rosy-eyed in mischaracterizing what is a national ambition on India's part. You're also right that, and I think Vikram made this point quite well, but the United States is a bit confused about its rules on things like data protection. That's right, we are confused. We are in a national debate, I think, to some extent over this. India also has been in a bit of a debate. I think, as Vikram said, we will settle those debates differently, though. And we won't end up in the same spot, just like, you're right, we won't be in the same spot necessarily with the Europeans. But characterizing a situation where US companies like Google and the Indian government come together and actually agree on projects on DPI or otherwise, as being evidence that we are adhering to sort of a like-minded ideology, I think is a mischaracterization. I mean, right, but you're saying basically they are aligned. Yes, they're aligned, but that's not necessarily evidence that we, the United States, are, say, protecting the individual rights and privacy in particular, of our people in precisely the way that many would be comfortable with. Okay, so that, I think that's a bit of going too far. Bottom line, I would just conclude by saying, I think it's important for the United States to take India's ambitions very seriously and to recognize where India would like to take this relationship and to factor that in at every step along the way. To sort of soft sell that or to anticipate that, the more we work together, the more they'll understand us and the more that they'll basically come to see everything the way we do, I think, and I'm not suggesting that my co-panelists are saying that, but I'm saying I think that's a broader concern of mine. The more disappointed I think both sides will be, and that's something to avoid.
I would just two-finger on that. I think that I've seen a lot more Sturm and Drang in the public discourse and a lot less in the at least official bilateral relations. I think the governments are exceedingly pragmatic about one another. Mm-hmm. They get that the ambitions of the two countries are congruent in many ways, are largely strategically aligned because of things like China's chosen direction. I think they understand in Washington that if China were to suddenly say, like, you know what, India, we're actually going to go back to the table and let's forget this, and we would like to go back to having an economic relationship and line of actual control. We're not going to, we're going to stop being such bullies up there. That India would probably welcome that, because talk about giving India some breathing room instead of having two active hostile fronts going back to just worrying mostly about one. I think India would largely welcome that. And I think that there might be those in the commentariat in the United States that would go, oh my God, they weren't really our friends about China because they're now, relaxing these controls. For the time being, India has far more restrictions on China than we do. TikTok is banned in India. China can't invest in Indian infrastructure. India has gone from being, welcoming of Chinese telecoms technology to saying you got to rip it all out, and that's still progressing, but it's farther than the United States or our allies have gone in many cases. But I think to Dan's point, we have to be realistic about one another, and the mutual benefit far outweighs the risk, even if you're very conservative in your approach to your risk mapping. But we are certainly not, we are not allies in a traditional sense. That said, let's remember, I think many times you'd rather have a partner of India than the ally in Paris, and from the US standpoint. So really depends on your perspective.
We need to be realistic about the French.
We are not
as well.
Gotta
talking
be
about
realistic
US,
about the
France.
French.
We are not talking about France. Rudy, you have 30 seconds.
I
To
just want to
go
make
to the
one
audience.
point. I think on Dan's point, look, my general sense is the practitioner community is way ahead on these realities than clearly the policy community. I'll just say that outright, right? So discussions and the questions that you're prompting over here are those which are being worked out and have been worked out primarily today because of the structure called ISET, right? They're very real. They have a clear understanding. The point that you're making is that India doesn't expect, I think, from the outside, as I see it, for you to just swallow the fact that we have a relationship with Russia. Everyone gets that. Maybe the policy community here doesn't, but everyone else gets that. And that's exactly what's been worked out when you have a very complicated agreement like GE, which has signed an agreement with the Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, which, by the way, is the same organization that does Sukhois, that's involved in BrahMos, that's got a Russia angle to it. Now, my own sense is your DOD, your Congress, your National Security Council, your State Department, Department of Energy, which are all the export control bodies in the country and the political leadership, have got a clear understanding of how this will actually work out in practice once GE actually starts co-producing and co-developing engines for light combat aircrafts. So a lot of what you're saying, Dan, I think is already in action. And that's why I kind of come back to the point that I genuinely think that the practitioner community is way ahead of the curve on this. Mm-hmm. On the last point I'll say is, you made the point about, I think sometimes it's important to be defensive about the perspective that you come in from in order to manage expectations and get that clarity clear, right? And I think that's what India and the US have done for the last 25 years. And I think that's what people like Lisa, Ashley, and a range of others have invested in, which has got us to a place today where you've actually been able to start on ISET in a play where you've got those expectations set, right? So when it's Russia, you're not starting from the bottom. When it's China, you're not starting from the bottom, right? ISET just monopolizes that and kind of takes it to a different level.
Thanks, Rudy. Questions? Right up front, John.
Thank you. So here is a view from Silicon Valley. While the Indian government, the US government are still figuring out, are talking about things and, seeing regulation, deregulation, China, while these two parental figures are sweating about all this, we in the Silicon Valley, we've got married to India. It's done. We're talking about this flywheel, Vikram, it's very true. We strongly believe that we are, and in fact, we are pulling all stops right now in making sure that we work with the Indian government. We lobby the Indian government as Americans to make sure that we decouple very fast from Russia. We see Russian partnership with military equipment as junk. We really need to get out of this relationship, number one. Number two, we need to pull all stops in making sure that both the governments understand that we are now joined at the hip with India. Silicon Valley, which is a driver, 90% driver of all innovation in the US, is now joined at the hip with India. whether the governments are on top of things or not. I mean, look at AI. Right now, India, every startup that I know in India right now is heavily into ChatGPT, Gemini, partnered with Google, partnered with OpenAI. There is, the synergies are so enormous, and the working between these two nations. So right now, I think the biggest challenge that I see right now is for all of us to be lobbying our governments to say, remove anything that's getting in the way of this partnership, and pull all stops while we are at it. That's where I see it from Silicon Valley. So thank you.
Right at the back, Dr. Nagar.
Thank you very much. I'm fellow in Hudson Institute, but based in Tokyo. I'm a strong supporter of the US-India technological cooperation. But as a basic question, if the US provide technology to India, what kind of benefit US will get from India? And that each speaker want or try to reply. I know that, but at the same time, I haven't identified. So that's why, could you give me some fixed examples in the past? Because example will be the one of the pattern we can repeat. So that is my question. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'll give a couple examples. I think one gets back to alternative supply chains and alternative technological hubs. The U.S. would like to see India develop in that way, so that you have alternatives, you have options to China, and then also for India to be able to have the capabilities to stand up to China, frankly. I think having increased capabilities, technological capabilities, particularly in the defense realm, will certainly help India to be able to fend off Chinese advances at the border, to match Chinese capabilities, naval capabilities, so that India can remain the dominant power in the Indian Ocean region, for example. So I think there's a lot that the U.S. actually achieves on the strategic perspective by having closer technology cooperation with India and sharing more and more of the sophisticated defense technologies with India.
I mean, I would just add that, I think the China point is really important. We want India to make life more complicated for China from a strategic standpoint. So not only that India can defend itself, which we see as a good thing, but that China has to think about India's capabilities on its Western front if it wants to do anything anywhere else. We want that to be problematic for China. But also, my favorite recent example is over the years, India has bought C-17s, it's leasing a couple of drones, and it's bought P-8s, which are maritime patrol aircraft that are used also for coordinating a lot of activities. And if you look at the recent Indian activities in the Red Sea, seizing or saving ships that have been seized by hostile actors in the Red Sea, you're seeing the Indian maritime commandos dropping out of the back of a C-17. You're watching a video feed, sometimes from an American drone, and the coordinating of all that maritime activity is utilizing P-8s that are using the Link 16 communication system, which is a secure US-based communication system that we use for communicating with allies and partners. There, that's the example. We didn't know that's where it would go because we don't know how India is going to use capabilities. But I liked, as an American defense official, and I wrote about this, but I liked seeing US capabilities being used by India to pursue a mission in support of global norms, the rule-based order, and preserving the security of shipping through the Red Sea and into the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, if I could, I just, maybe it's already been said, but it deserves highlighting again, given the nature of your question. The United States' economy has benefited from Indians for decades, and from the commercial interaction with Indian companies back in India for decades, and that continues to be the case. So we, America, benefit from jobs, from technologies, from capabilities that we would never have had if not for the nature of that relationship. So Maybe it's so obvious that it's just right out there. You don't even say it because it's right there, but it's essential and deserves attention. So that part, yeah, shouldn't be underestimated.
In fact, even about China, about Rudy's point about China, sort of like, is this India's problem to worry about decoupling, about US decoupling from? Yes, it is India's problem. It is, we in the Valley sit there and say, we are constantly egging on the Indian bureaucrats to say, move fast, help with Russia decoupling from, with US decoupling from China, because it's in our interest, it's in India's interest to do this. It's in our strategic interest. So on one hand, India can continue pretending to be running on a policy of strategic, sort of ambiguity. Dr. Jaishankar loves talking about it, and that's fine, because we do have some, Cold War legacy connections with places like Russia and so on. But we, in practical terms, even if we pretend strategic, ambiguity, we on the ground, we need to do something which is much more radical.
Can I make one point upon that? Sure. Hey, Asha, just on your point, I'll just say this. I'm not seeing much of that ambiguity, right? If you talk about China de-risking India, we're a country that said no to massive manufacturing opportunity from BYD. It was a huge investment from a Chinese car making company, right? Your guy, Elon Musk, went to China, right? He didn't double down on India. So I think, to be absolutely clear, the ambiguity on China, and just to highlight a point that Vikram made, India is pretty clear-eyed when it comes to what does de-risking on China mean. And this is hard stuff for India. We need the jobs, we need the manufacturing, we need the capital, but we said no.
Rudy, the Indian government pushed back on Tesla. They lost that opportunity. And so...
I don't know, he landed up in China.
I know, but that's our fault. That's India's fault.
Okay.
Indian government's fault.
Okay.
So we need to work on that.
If we could, question here, and then I have the young man.
Good afternoon, Namaste ji, kaise ho? I'm Chris Orr. Okay, Namaste ji, kaise ho? I'm Chris Orr, proud Hudson donor, former U.S. Air Force officer, and now a military and defense aviation writer for simpleflying.com. Having thus self-identified, probably no surprise I'm going to ask an aviation-related question. Rudy, you already touched upon, the Tejas light combat aircraft, which is homegrown, and then, here we go, the Sukhoi Su-30 flanker. With that in mind, two-part question. I guess this goes out to the whole panel. What do you see for the current and future status of direct cooperation between the U.S. Air Force and the Indian Air Force, especially in the context of those two platforms mentioned? Number two, the prospect for cooperation between U.S. naval aviation and the Indian Navy's naval air arm, especially in the context of India's budding aircraft carrier program, and here we go again, the use of the old 1970s Soviet-designed MiG-29 Fulcrum fighter. Thank you. Shukriya. Dhanyabad.
On the U.S. naval cooperation, I think you are kind of already hinted at that in your question. That I think that is where the concern is in terms of India's continued reliance on Russia, and where it could, as I said in my opening remarks, impact U.S. ability to have those sensitive communication interlinks with India in the future. But in terms of the Air Force cooperation, the U.S. missed out on providing India's fighter airjet needs. There was a stiff competition for that, but that's, we let that go. Bygones be bygones. But in terms of that kind of cooperation, I think you're going to see it in the exercises that we do. India exercises more with the United States than any other country when it comes to military exercises by a large margin. And these are growing increasingly sophisticated. We even had one in 2022, which was very close to the line of actual control. Chinese did not like that very much, but it sent a signal about the growing closeness between, all of our military sectors. So, I would say that, that when it comes to Air Force cooperation, I think you're going to see that increase more and more in terms of how we exercise together?
No, I mean, I think both services exercise together tremendously well. The United States would obviously welcome being the provider of a future Indian Air Force capability. That seems like it's not that likely, and I think it's unclear whether India will do a big buy or will try to go indigenous. I think that's, I think after decades working on that issue, I think there's a likelihood that India tries to go domestic, and then it has hopefully, probably very likely U.S. engines on that platform. I doubt. I think Boeing would still welcome a naval, being the naval fighter. India would rather have a transitional period and then go to an indigenous naval fighter. I think these are all things that are it's sort of same as it ever was. Like there's pieces the Indians will procure. There's things that could be co-developed. From an American standpoint, I mean, probably strategically speaking, if they have a French fighter and not a Russian fighter, we will feel better about that. But it has not prevented us from working together, the fact that they are flying Russian fighters. That's not, and I think you just need to think of the lesson of Eastern Europe and our, NATO expansion. We brought into NATO many nations that were exclusively equipped with Soviet-era material and are still using that material now. And we are depending on a lot of it even to hold off Russia in Ukraine. So I think we overstate the risk from these diverse sources of platforms as well. Aparna's first question to me was, why are we sharing the crown jewels? Well, and then Dan touched on it twice. The crown jewels include strategic systems like missiles and SSBNs, and we're not offering to provide ICBMs or nuclear-capable submarines to India. We've hardly figured out how to do it with Australia. For Australia, it's taken probably 50% of the brain power and time and energy of the Defense Department to just get to partway down that road. So I think we just similarly don't expect it. Why would we expect India to give up its missiles and submarines, right? So I think it's just a fun parlor debate at this point. This doesn't have a lot of relevance on the actual cooperation.
So, I have 2 minutes. So the young gentleman up here front, John, and the gentleman on the third row. That'll be the last two up here, and then the gentleman on the other side.
Thank you.
Brief questions, please.
Okay. Thank you for having this very interesting discussion. I wanted to ask about, I think the Micron ATP plant seems like a big deal. What do you think India's competitive advantages in attracting more investment in that segment? Do you think where do you see the opportunity there?
And could you pass the mic to the gentleman on the third? Yeah.
So we have talked about basically partnership and sustainability of the partnership and its possible acceleration. A fundamental thing for that requires a strategic complementarity. And that's where the biggest problem arises. And it's different than tactical. Tactical complementarity, we can talk about a lot of things. American companies make more profit. Strategic complementarity is missing. And how do you get over it? Number one, multipolar versus unipolar. The US defense strategy, every strategy says US insists on being a unipolar. That's the preferred geopolitical order. India is very clear that we cannot have anything but a multipolar. Economically, I've worked 30 years in multilateral institutions, etc. Almost everywhere, let's say, Indian and US interests have actually been adversarial to the extent you have adversarial, but while Chinese interests in India have been very complementary. Economic outside, technology-wise also, one would argue that there is complementarity between Indian and, let's say, Chinese or even Russian. And lastly, defense. I won't get into the last part. So how do we get over that strategic discordance as opposed to complementarity?
So I'll take the first question on the Micron deal. So the Micron deal actually has had a galvanizing effect. You've seen it followed in a few months by the deal with Tata and PSMC from Taiwan. That's been the first benefit, is sort of like people to believe that there's indeed space to invest in India in this particular field. Secondly, I would say that the idea is not to look necessarily at any particular part of the value chain. It's also to look at the larger trends as well. So there was a report in the ICIT which came out from the ITIF think tank a few months back, and that sort of tackled the different parts of the value chain and the lay of the land in India as well. What it did not go into was the trends, and I think it's better to focus on trends like sustainability. For example, a lot of the mobile manufacturing companies, the consumer electronic companies have this mandate to go net zero by 2030. So 85% of their effluents basically are all because of semiconductors. So whichever country can sort of get the head start over here and sort of making plants, be it packaging or like fabrication foundries, which essentially pollute less, make a clean green transition, will sort of have the lead in that front. Lastly, I'll just go into the fact that this has also had an effect on the Indian bureaucracy as well. So the Micron deal actually was negotiated in record time of 5 months. There was something called an advanced pricing agreement called an APA, which is basically a pre-ascertainment of your tax liabilities. This is something which takes time, like even 5-6 years, many like developed nations as well. Whereas in the case of India, this actually was negotiated with the Ministry of Electronics and IT within a span of 5 months. And I think that's something to be, commended upon. So I would say Indian bureaucracy has sort of seen a change of heart when it comes to dealing with foreign investors. The fact that other investors like Tatas and PSMCs have seen value in investing in India. And the fact that this shows that India can indeed sort of be a hub for packaging, which, by the way, would be probably the next big area in semiconductors. Lithography has reached its limit in terms of shrinking the chip size, right? So now the biggest performance mileage is going to be squeezed out of the packaging part. You're not going to see so much of value being given out by the shrinking of the chip size anymore. You will essentially have to stack 2D and 3D chips on top of each other. And if India can sort of get a lead in that particular sector, then there's a lot of promise over there.
So I'll just go down the panel and ask everybody to make their final comments. Lisa, Rudy, Vikram, and Dan.
Yeah, I guess I would come back to the last question, and it's less a case of unipolar versus multipolar order. It's really, do you want to see a global order that is free and open and respects sovereignty of nations, or do you want to see what Russia and China are trying to do, which is trying to diminish U.S. influence in the global order and shape it more to their liking, and in a world in which Russia can invade Ukraine illegally and unjustifiably. So I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about do we want a free and open global order where the U.S. continues to have influence as a democracy, or do we want to see the current order sort of upset, overturned, U.S. Undermined in this order? So I think that's really what we're talking about. And Rudy himself said that India is concerned about Russia and China's enhanced relationship or partnership. So is the United States. It's extremely concerned. And then to see the kind of cooperation that both Russia and China are having with North Korea and Iran, one starts to become concerned about, what are we looking at in the future? This is a threat to all nations that support a current order of countries maintaining their own sovereignty and remaining, that the global commons remain available to all countries and cannot be sort of, overtaken or dominated by any one country.
Yeah, I think just the one point is, I think the lack of strategic articulation or common articulation should not be mistaken for lack of strategy. Now, I just want you to think about the following 5 or 6 things and think 10 years out, right? So think we're in 2034. Defense, and it comes to your question, we possibly have one of the largest P-8 fleets today anywhere in the world. All our airlift capabilities moving to the United States. In the potential future, you'll have an aircraft carrier that will either be British, French, or American, or a combination of 3 in all probability. You're looking at a semiconductor ecosystem by 2034 that will hopefully be a hub for super ATPs, right, which we think is the future of semiconductors, right? A number of those facilities will be American, some will be Japanese, some will be Korean, right? You already have a rich marriage between Silicon Valley and India. I think that could actually be more strategic, frankly. A lot of it is behind walled gardens, but it's important, right? Now think about all these interactions, right? 10 years from now. AI, quantum, defense, semiconductor, engine co-production, and you're co-producing to also export, right? Maybe missile production, and so on and so forth. My own sense is that it's in fact, ironically, the lack of common strategic articulation which makes it a bit easier for practitioners to be able to actually do the strategic things that we're seeing in progress. We have some challenges. We have export control issues. There may be some questions around how you see an imperative, how I see an imperative, so on and so forth. General drift is commonality, right? So my sense is we shouldn't worry too much about the both sides expressing things together. We should just be concerned about what they're doing together.
Well, and then, but they do express a lot of things together. I mean, again, I think these joint statements coming out of these visits are like 24 pages long.
Yeah.
And they're full of expressions of common strategic views. And I think just a little tour around the world shows you that actually the interests are common. It's not that India wanted Russia to invade Ukraine. It's a disaster for India. They would far rather it didn't happen, and they would far rather it ended now. And what they don't care as much about as we do is the terms of that ending. They just would like it to end, but it's not something that they were seeking. And they don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon, and they don't like that the junta took over in Myanmar, and they didn't want the Taliban to take over in Afghanistan, and they don't want China to bully its way to solving territorial disputes in the South China Sea or to invade Taiwan, and they don't. So overall, we have actually extraordinary amounts of strategic alignment, but we have different geopolitical realities, right? So what we are willing to do as the, wealthiest and most powerful country in the world in the United States is different from what India is willing to do sitting in its neighborhood where it's got an immediate worry about China and Pakistan and stability in the ocean region, where it would like very much to be able to focus its efforts and to, be helpful as it can, but not put its neck out in a way that would be, cause self-harm, essentially. So I don't think it's a strategic misalignment. And technology is where a lot of the cooperation is active and very fruitful, and that's why you see this energy behind the technology piece. And to multipolar versus unipolar, I mean, it would be very strange for a unipolar power to want to lose its unipolar status, and it would be very strange for everybody else to want it to keep it, right? So I just think that's natural.
Yeah, let me just pick up. I think we wouldn't be having this conversation here today if there weren't a remarkable and kind of exciting set of convergences of interest between the United States and India. So that's the starting point for the conversation. But where I also think it's important for us to be thinking out ahead, and in some ways thinking out ahead of the practitioners who may be acting in the moment, who are busily pushing us forward, which is what they are supposed to do. But we also have an obligation to be thinking about what the sort of the ends are in mind. And that doesn't mean stopping or curtailing, but thinking as much as we are able, sort of wisely about what certain constraints ought to be, and maybe identifying the pitfalls or potholes that are in the way. And I think there are some, and I think they're very real. And so it's also our obligation not to kind of sugarcoat them or look the other direction. There is a strategic ambition on India's part for being a civilizational power in the world, for being a great nation on the world stage. And that is not necessarily incompatible with the American ambition of also being a great state on the world stage. But they would, inevitably, as you say, naturally, there will also be natural points of friction in that transitional process, as we've seen in other cases. So, we should be watching out for those as well. That's at least one lesson that I draw from the nature of our decades-long process of watching the US-China relationship. Again, they're not the same, but we should learn from some of the mistakes that we've made in the past.
Thank you very much to the entire panel and to all of you. There is lunch, so please make sure you have something to eat. Thank you very much.